Imagine standing at the very gates of the mansion you paid for, wearing tattered clothes and carrying nothing but a plastic bag, only to find that the people you've spent a lifetime protecting don't even want to let you inside. For 20 years, Elias Thorne was the invisible hand that turned his family's struggles into a dynasty. But today, he isn't the billionaire CEO. He is a man who appears to have lost everything, standing in the rain, waiting to see if the love of his family was built on a foundation of heart or a pile of gold. What happened next didn't just break his heart. It redefined everything he thought he knew about loyalty. Elias Thorne was a name, whispered in the corridors of power, with equal parts respect and fear. He was a self-made man who had built a global logistics empire from a single delivery van. But as the years passed, the silence in his glass office grew louder than the ringing of his phones. He had provided his siblings, his mother, and his extended relatives with everything they could ever desire. His brother Julian drove Italian sports cars. His sister Clarissa lived in a penthouse he purchased. And his mother, Martha, presided over a sprawling estate that Elias had, designed to be a sanctuary for them all. Yet Elias realized that he hadn't seen their faces. Without a request for a wire, transfer, or a signature for a loan in nearly 5 years, they loved the provider, but did they love the man? The idea for the experiment took root on a cold Tuesday evening. Elias decided he would disappear for a month, letting the news leak through back channels that his company had collapsed under the weight of a massive fraud investigation. He froze his own accounts, swapped his bespoke Italian suit for a faded hoodie and worn jeans, and left his luxury watch in a safe. He looked like a man who had spent the last week sleeping in a bus station. He wanted to return to the family mansion, the house he built, as a man with nothing left but his name. He wondered if the doors he had opened for everyone else would still swing wide for him when he had no gifts to offer. He arrived at the gates of the Thorne estate just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The security guard, a man Elias had personally hired and paid a generous salary for a decade, squinted through the rain at the disheveled figure. Elias didn't use his remote. He rang the intercom like a stranger. When the guard finally recognized him, there was no warmth, only a look of profound confusion and a hint of disdain. The guard didn't offer an umbrella or a greeting. He simply buzzed the gate open with a sharp, mechanical click that felt like a warning. Walking up the long, winding driveway, Elias felt the weight of the silence. Usually his arrival was met with the sound of servants rushing to take his coat and his siblings, appearing with glasses of expensive scotch, eager to tell him about their latest business ideas that required his capital. Tonight the house looked like a fortress. He reached the heavy oak doors and took a deep breath. He wasn't just testing his family. He was testing the validity of his entire life's work. If the love was gone, then the empire he had built was nothing more than a gilded cage. He knocked, the sound echoing through the foyer, and waited for the world he had created to answer. The door was opened by Clarissa. She was dressed for a gala, dripping in diamonds that Elias had bought her for her 30th birthday. When she saw him, her jaw didn't drop in concern. It tightened in embarrassment. She didn't hug him. Instead, she looked over his shoulder to see if any of her friends might be watching from the driveway. She ushered him into the hallway quickly, as if he were a leak in the ceiling that needed to be hidden. Within minutes, the entire family had gathered in the drawing room. The atmosphere wasn't one of a reunion. It felt like a deposition. Julian stood by the fireplace swirling a cognac. He had already seen the fake news reports Elias had planted. He didn't ask if Elias was okay or where he had been sleeping. His first words were about the trust fund. He wanted to know if the creditors could come. After the assets Elias had settled on the family, Martha, their mother, sat in her high-backed chair, looking at her son as if he were a ghost that had stayed too long. She complained about the stress this scandal would bring to their social standing. The irony was suffocating. Elias had spent 20 years ensuring they never felt a moment of stress, and their only concern was that his perceived failure might inconvenience their lifestyle. As the evening wore on, the mask slipped further. Elias told them a fabricated story about how he had lost the house, the cars, and the liquidity. He told them he needed a place to stay for a few months while he got back on his feet. The reaction was a chilling masterclass in avoidance. Clarissa mentioned that her guest rooms were being renovated. Julian suggested that staying at the mansion would be bad optics for the family's reputation while the legal battles were ongoing. They spoke about him as if he weren't in the room, discussing his downfall as a logistical problem rather than a family tragedy. The most painful part was the dinner. Usually the table was laden with the finest meats and wines. Tonight the staff, acting on Julian's subtle cues, served Elias a plate of leftovers in the kitchen while the family ate in the dining room. They didn't want a bankrupt man at the table. Elisa sat on a wooden stool, eating cold chicken, listening to the muffled laughter of his siblings in the next room. He realized that to them he was never a brother or a son. He was an ATM. Now that the machine was broken, they were ready to discard it. The walls he had built to protect them were now being used to shut him out. The following morning, the tension reached a boiling point. Elias had spent the night in a small, cramped servant's room in the attic. The only place Martha said was available. He came downstairs to find Julian and Clarissa huddled over a laptop. They weren't looking for lawyers to help him. They were looking for ways to legally distance themselves from his debts. When Elias walked in, Julian didn't even look up. He told Elias that it would be best if he left by the end of the day. He claimed that the energy in the house was becoming too negative and that their mother's health was at risk because of the shame Elias had brought upon them. Elias looked at his brother, the man whose gambling debts he had cleared 3 times, and felt a surge of cold clarity. He asked Julian if he remembered the winter of 1998, when they had no heating and Elias worked 3 jobs to buy Julian his first car. Julian simply waved his hand dismissively, saying that the past was the past and that Elias had clearly become irresponsible in his old age. The cruelty was calculated. They wanted him gone before the stink of poverty could rub off on their pristine reputations. Just as the argument escalated, a voice interrupted from the doorway. It was Sarah, the daughter of the woman who had been the Thorne family's housekeeper for 20 years. Sarah had grown up in the shadows of the mansion, often helping her mother with the chores while Elias paid for her nursing school in secret, something he had never told his family. She had heard the way they were speaking to him, unlike his own flesh and blood. Sarah walked straight up to Elias and placed a hand on his arm. She didn't see a fallen tycoon. She saw the man who had checked on her mother every time she was ill. Sarah turned to Julian and Clarissa, her voice trembling with indignation. She told them they should be ashamed of themselves. She reminded them that every brick of the house they stood in was laid with Elias's sweat. She then turned back to Elias and said the words that changed everything. She told him that she had a small 2-bedroom flat in the city, and that he was welcome to stay there as long as he needed. She offered him her savings, a modest amount she had put aside for her postgraduate studies to help him get back on his feet. In that moment, the contrast was blinding. The people he had given everything to offered him nothing, while the person he had helped in secret was willing to give him her all. The room fell silent as Sarah's offer hung in the air. Julian laughed, a dry, mocking sound, calling the gesture pathetic and telling Sarah to get back to her work. But Elias had seen enough. The experiment was over, and the results were devastating. He stood up straight, his posture shifting from the slumped shoulders of a broken man to the commanding presence of a titan. He pulled a small encrypted smartphone from his pocket, a device that definitely didn't belong to a bankrupt. Bannon made a single phone call. He spoke in a low, firm voice, giving instructions to his head of security and his chief legal officer. Within 20 minutes, 3 black SUVs roared up the driveway. A team of men in suits stepped out, led by Elias's personal attorney. The family watched from the window, confused and suddenly terrified. Elias turned to his mother, his brother, and his sister. He told them the truth, that he wasn't broke, that his company was stronger than ever, and that the news they had seen was a controlled leak designed to test the one thing money couldn't buy: loyalty. The color drained from Julian's face. Clarissa began to stammer, trying to reach out and touch Elias's arm, but he stepped back, his expression like granite. He looked at Martha, who was now weeping, claiming she was just Confused and worried for the family's future, Elias shook his head. He told them that he had spent his life building a safety net for people who were waiting for him to fall so they could cut the ropes. He informed them that as of that moment, the Thorne family trust was being dissolved. The mansion, the cars, the allowances, and the luxury lifestyles were all tied to his ownership. He gave them exactly 24 hours to pack their belongings. He wasn't being cruel. He was simply stopping the subsidization of their disrespect. The most emotional moment came when Elias turned back to Sarah. She stood there, stunned, realized that the man she had just offered her life savings to was actually one of the wealthiest men in the country. Elias took her hands in his and thanked her. He told her that her kindness was the only thing that had kept his faith in humanity alive during this trial. He didn't just promise to pay for her school. He told her he was setting up a foundation in her mother's name. As his family began to wail and plead for forgiveness, Elias realized that the weight he had been carrying for years, the weight of providing for ungrateful people, had finally lifted. He felt lighter than he had in decades. The aftermath of the poverty test was swift and absolute. Elias moved into a smaller, more modest home, finding that the vastness of the mansion had only served to echo the emptiness of his relationships. Julian and Clarissa, forced to find actual employment for the first time in their lives, struggled to adapt to a world that didn't bow to their last name. They sent letters and made hundreds of phone calls, but Elias remained unreachable. He didn't hate them. He simply realized that his presence in their lives had enabled their selfishness. By removing his support, he was giving them the only gift they had left to receive, the opportunity to grow up. Elias spent much of his time working with Sarah and her mother to build the Loyalty Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting young students who came from underprivileged backgrounds but possessed the character and heart to give back to their communities. He found more joy in a single afternoon of mentoring these students than he had in 10 years of board meetings. He learned that wealth isn't the number of zeros in a bank account, but the number of people who would stand by you when those zeros disappear. He finally understood that he had been building the wrong kind of legacy for a long time. 1 year later, Elias sat on a park bench watching the sunset. He was dressed simply, no longer needing the armor of expensive suits to feel powerful. He had reconciled with the fact that family isn't always defined by blood, but by the people who see your soul even when your pockets are empty. He had lost a mother and siblings in the traditional sense, but he had gained a community of genuine souls who loved him for his wisdom and his kindness rather than his net worth. The mansion was sold, and the proceeds were donated to various charities, turning a monument of greed into a fountain of hope. The lesson Elias Thorne learned is one that resonates for everyone. The true measure of a person is seen not in how they treat the powerful, but in how they treat those they believe can do nothing for them. He had returned home pretending to be poor to test his family, and while their failure was a tragedy, it allowed him to find a life that was truly rich. He walked away from the shadows of his past, into a future where every smile was earned and every hand held was sincere. He was finally home, not in a house but in a life built on truth. Elias Thorne's journey serves as a powerful reminder that the brightest lights often reveal the darkest shadows. We spend so much of our lives building walls and accumulating things, thinking they will protect us, but the only real security we have is the character of the people we surround ourselves with. If you lost everything tomorrow, who would still be standing by your side? Don't wait for a crisis to find out. Cherish the people who love you for who you are, not what you have, because in the end, love is the only currency that never devalues. Thank you for listening to this story. May it inspire you to value the hearts around you more than the things they can provide.